When the HOA decided to block my crops with an impenetrable fence, they thought they'd won. But little did they know, I had a plan. What they didn't realize was that I had the resources to take control of the situation and turn their attempt to ruin my livelihood into a triumph. The fence they built to isolate me only made me stronger, and I was about to prove it. But the real twist? I wasn't just going to fight them. I was going to own them. It all began innocently enough. Nestled on the outskirts of a peaceful neighborhood was my little farm. It was an oasis of green, a place where life thrived and grew under the warmth of the sun. I had planted my crops with care, from the bright orange marigolds to rows of hardy tomatoes, sweet peppers, and green lettuce. My farm wasn't just a source of fresh produce for my family. It had become something more. It was my personal statement of independence, a living testament to my belief in self-sustainability. It was a place where I could feel connected to the earth, a place where every day brought a new sense of accomplishment. As the seasons passed, I began to notice my farm becoming a part of the neighborhood. People who lived nearby would often stop by, sharing smiles and friendly waves as they admired the fruits of my labor. It was a small, close-knit community, and the neighbors were always willing to lend a hand or offer advice. We had all grown, accustomed to the rhythm of life in this quiet corner of the world. There was a comforting simplicity to it all, where rules were respected, but no one was ever overly stringent about enforcement. The HOA, while present, had never been much of a concern. They had their rules, yes, but they seemed more like guidelines than hard and fast laws. They were there to ensure that the neighborhood stayed orderly, and for the most part, people complied out of respect for the community. However, as I would soon learn, the HOA's version of order had very little tolerance for the unconventional. It all started one afternoon when I received a letter from them, its tone formal and distant, the kind of message that only bureaucrats can craft. It stated that I was in violation of a rule, though like most regulations handed down by the HOA, it wasn't entirely clear what that violation was. Apparently, there was an issue with the positioning of my farmed land. The letter made vague references to property lines and how I was encroaching on communal space, but there was no clear explanation. No one had ever mentioned this rule to me before, and frankly, it seemed so minor that I brushed it off. After all, this wasn't the first time the HOA had raised a concern over something trivial. In retrospect, I should have taken it more seriously. The first letter was merely a warning, a gentle nudge to correct what was, in their eyes, an issue. I responded by assuring them that I would look into it and make any necessary adjustments. But the HOA had other plans. The next notice arrived a few weeks later, this one more forceful. It demanded that I take immediate action to correct the supposed violation, threatening fines and other penalties if I didn't comply. I was stunned. What had once seemed like a benign neighborhood association was now escalating the situation, turning a simple miscommunication into a bureaucratic war. Each successive letter grew more aggressive. The tone of their demands became sharper, as if they were trying to wear me down, hoping that I would cave under pressure. They threatened legal action, citing obscure zoning laws and the potential for long-term damage to the neighborhood's aesthetics. It felt like overkill, especially since my farm had been nothing but an asset to the community. I had never received a complaint about the appearance of my land. If anything, people admired the beauty of the crops and the way the farm was maintained. But to the HOA, the regulations were paramount, and they had made it clear that their interpretation of the rules was the only one that mattered. One morning, I woke up to a scene that took my breath away. When I stepped outside, I saw it, an enormous fence, taller than any I had ever seen in the neighborhood, stretching across the property line. It wasn't just any fence. It was a fortress, an imposing wall of wood and metal that had been erected overnight. The once open space where my crops had thrived was now shut off from the world, and it was impossible to ignore. The fence wasn't just an eyesore. It was a statement. It was the HOA's declaration of dominance, an attempt to control and isolate me, to shut me out of my own land. I stood frozen in front of it, staring at the structure that now divided my life in two. On one side, there was my farm, a symbol of my hard work and dedication. On the other, there was the world beyond, a world that I could no longer easily reach. My crops, my livelihood, were now cut off from the road, from my neighbors, from everything I had worked so hard to create. The fence wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a mental and emotional one as well. I felt trapped, as if my very existence was being restricted by the actions of people who didn't understand what I had built. How could they do this? How could they come into my life, into my space, and take away something so personal, so meaningful? I had never done anything wrong. I had followed the rules. I had worked tirelessly to grow something beautiful, and now, in an instant, it was all being taken away from me. But even as anger surged through me, something else stirred within me, a sense of determination. I wasn't going to let this be the end. This fence, this arbitrary line drawn by the HOA, was not going to define me. I refused to let them win. They may have built the wall, but I was the one who could tear it down. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the HOA hadn't just fenced off my crops. They had made a grave mistake. They had underestimated my resilience. In the face of their oppressive rule, I wasn't going to shrink back and accept defeat. No, this was my land, my farm, my home. They had tried to take control, but I wasn't about to let them. The fence was just the beginning of something much bigger, something that would not only reclaim my land but take back my power. I was about to make them regret ever thinking they could get away with this. And so I began to plan. The air was thick with frustration as I stood before the towering fence. My eyes traced every wooden plank, every steel bar that had been placed, so deliberately across my land. My chest heaved with anger, but beneath that fury, something else simmered. Something sharper, something more dangerous. It was a realization. The HOA had underestimated me. They thought that by erecting a fence, by imposing their arbitrary rules and regulations, they could force me to comply, to fold under the weight of their power. But they were wrong. They had pushed me too far. I wasn't going to just accept defeat. No, this was my property, my land. I had worked tirelessly for years to build what I had, and I wasn't going to let some faceless bureaucrats in a boardroom dictate my future. I knew the rules better than they did, and I was willing to fight with everything I had to ensure that they couldn't take this from me. The realization settled deep within me, a quiet fire that began to grow. This wasn't just a fight over a fence. It wasn't even about the crops or the land itself. It was about freedom, the freedom to do with my land as I saw fit. The HOA, with all its rules and regulations, had assumed they could just control every aspect of my life. But they didn't realize that I wasn't the kind of person who would quietly submit. I had been preparing for this moment for years, even if I hadn't known it at the time. I spent the next few nights barely sleeping, my mind racing with possibilities. There had to be a way to beat them. There had to be a way to take back control. I had been wrong to think that simply fighting the fence head-on would work. I needed to outsmart them, to do something that would hit them where it hurt the most. And then, the idea struck me. Brilliant and daring. Why not take complete control of the situation? What if instead of battling against the fence they had built, I bought the very land that was the key to unlocking it all? I had always known about the vacant lot adjacent to my farm. It had sat there unused and neglected for as long as I could remember. The HOA had its eye on it. Of course they did. They controlled everything else in the neighborhood, so it only made sense that they'd eventually set their sights on this piece of land. The lot was the one thing standing between my farm and freedom. It was the gateway, the only way in or out of the fenced area. Without it, I would remain locked out of my own property, forced to live in isolation, unable to access the crops I had nurtured for so long. The HOA could control it, but they didn't yet know what I was capable of. I didn't hesitate. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I went straight to the local real estate office, my resolve hardening with every step. The lot was vacant, owned by a third-party investor who had no real interest in it. But it was in prime location and I could already see the possibilities. If I could just get my hands on it, everything would change. I had the means to do it. I didn't need anyone's permission. I could make an offer that was too good to refuse. If I bought the lot, I would not only own the key to the fenced area, but I would also put myself in a position to take control of the situation entirely. The real estate agent was surprised when I made the inquiry. I knew they were used to dealing with families looking for a nice piece of land for a house or a weekend getaway, not someone like me. But as soon as I laid out my intentions, they understood. The vacant lot wasn't just a piece of land. It was leverage, and I was prepared to offer far more than it was worth. I didn't care about the cost. I needed it, and I was willing to pay whatever it took. By the end of the day, I had an agreement in place. The HOA had no idea what I was about to do. They had no idea that by the time they even thought to respond to my challenge, I would already have my foot firmly in the door. I was going to own the land they thought they controlled, and once I did, I would have the power to unlock the gate and walk right through it. I wasn't just going to fight them, I was going to own them. For the next few days, I worked quickly to finalize the purchase. There were hurdles to jump through, paperwork to sign, but I had never been more determined in my life. This wasn't just about fighting a petty zoning dispute. It was about taking a stand, about reclaiming control over my own future. As the final documents were signed, the deal was sealed. I now owned the land. The HOA could no longer stand in my way. The moment the deal was complete, I felt a rush of satisfaction. The HOA had thought they could use their bureaucracy to break me. They had thought they could box me in, corner me, and force me to bend, but they had made one critical mistake. They hadn't counted on me thinking 2 steps ahead. They hadn't counted on my resilience. And now, I had the key to everything. I knew what I had to do next. The HOA would be furious when they realized what I had done. They would scramble to figure out how to stop me, how to regain control. But it was too late. The land was mine, and with it, the power was mine. I wasn't just going to let them take away my crops. I was going to show them that they couldn't control me, couldn't control my life. The fence they had built to isolate me was now meaningless. With the key to the gate in my hand, I could walk right through it and take back everything they had tried to take from me. But this wasn't just a victory over the HOA. It was a victory over anyone who thought they could trample on my dreams. They had underestimated me, and now it was time to show them the real consequences of their actions. I was about to turn the tables, to reclaim my land and my freedom, and I would make sure they never forgot it. The HOA had thought they had won. They thought their fence, so meticulously built and carefully placed, had severed the connection between me and my land. The fence was more than a structure. It was their claim to victory, a statement that they held all the power, that they could control even the smallest details of my life. What they didn't know was that I had been planning my next move, one that would completely dismantle their sense of control over me. I had spent days obsessively researching every aspect of the property around me. I knew the vacant lot was essential, more than just a plot of land. It was the key to everything. It was the point of access, the only way through the gate, and the land that could restore the very connection between me and the crops I had worked so hard to cultivate. The HOA hadn't shown any interest in purchasing the lot. It was just a piece of land left to languish, and they hadn't considered its value. They assumed that, like most others, I would eventually tire of fighting them and give in. But they had misjudged me completely. When I approached the seller, I knew I had to make an offer that would not only be appealing, but irresistible. This was my chance to take control. I didn't just want the lot. I wanted the entire situation to change. So, I made an offer that went well beyond what the seller could have imagined. My offer wasn't based on what the land was worth. It was based on what it was going to mean. It was going to be the key to unlocking the gate and taking control of my property. The seller accepted the offer in a matter of hours, and the deal was finalized quickly. Within days, I was the proud owner of the vacant lot. It was an exhilarating feeling, holding the deed in my hand, knowing that I now had full ownership of the land, and the gate that separated me from my farm felt like a personal victory. But the reality of what I had just done began to settle in. This wasn't just a victory over the HOA, it was a victory for myself. It was a statement that I wasn't going to be bullied or pushed around anymore. The gate that once kept me away from my own crops now belonged to me. The lock that had kept me out was now mine to unlock. I had the key to every door and every gate, a position of power the HOA had never imagined I would be in. The next time I stood in front of the fence, I felt a sense of calm rather than frustration. This time I wasn't looking at an obstacle. I wasn't seeing the wall that had been built to keep me away from my land. I was seeing an opportunity. The fence wasn't a barrier anymore. It was a symbol of the power I now held, with the deed in my pocket and the key to the gate in my hand. I knew it was time to take the next step. I walked toward the gate, the sound of my footsteps crisp against the quiet, still air. My heart raced with anticipation as I approached the lock. It was a moment I had been waiting for. I stood before the gate, my hand on the key, and for the first time since the fence had gone up, I felt an overwhelming sense of control. The HOA had done everything they could to lock me out of my own life. But now it was my turn to turn the key. I slid the key into the lock, feeling the satisfying click as the bolt released. Slowly, I pushed the gate open, the sound of the hinges creaking. In protest, as if the gate itself was reluctant to yield. But yield it did, and as I swung it wide open, I couldn't help but feel a rush of triumph. I wasn't just walking through the gate, I was walking through a symbolic door, one that represented my freedom. The HOA's fence, which they had built to keep me confined, now stood as a mere reminder of their overreach. The power had shifted. Where once the fence had symbolized their dominance, now it stood as a testament to my victory. I was no longer fighting for my crops or my land. I was fighting for my right to exist without the interference of those who sought to control me. And with the key to every locked door in my hand, I knew that I had reclaimed what was mine. As I stepped through the gate and onto my farm, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The crops were still there, as vibrant and full of life as ever. The tomatoes were ripening on the vine, the peppers were turning bright shades of red and yellow, and the rows of lettuce were crisp and fresh. I had fought for this, for the right to keep my farm, my land, my livelihood, and now I had won. The fence that had once seemed so imposing was now just another structure that I had overcome. It was no longer a symbol of the HOA's control. It was a reminder of what I had endured and ultimately triumphed over. I stood in the middle of my farm, surveying the land with a deep sense of satisfaction. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sun cast a warm glow over the crops, and I could hear the faint chirping of birds in the distance. This was my space. This was my land. And no one, no HOA, no board of faceless officials, was going to take it from me. But I wasn't done yet. I had made my move, and now it was time to ensure that the HOA couldn't continue to dictate how I lived my life. The land was mine, but the HOA was still out there, lurking in the shadows, thinking they could control me from behind the scenes. I needed to make sure that this wasn't just a personal victory. I needed to make it a statement, something that would make them think twice before ever trying to overstep their bounds again. I made a few phone calls. I reached out to my neighbors, the ones who had supported me through this whole ordeal. They had seen the HOA's tactics firsthand, had heard their threats and their demands. Now it was time for them to stand with me. Together, we could push back against the HOA, show them that we wouldn't be intimidated. My farm wasn't just mine anymore. It was a symbol of what could happen when a community came together to fight for what was right. As the days passed, I worked tirelessly to repair the damage the HOA had caused, to show my neighbors that they weren't alone in this fight. Slowly, the community began to rally around me. The more I spoke to my neighbors, the more they realized they weren't just fighting for my farm. They were fighting for their own rights, too. The HOA's overreach wasn't just something that affected me. It affected everyone in the neighborhood. And together, we could stand against it. But even as the support of my neighbors grew, the HOA remained silent. They hadn't yet realized the full extent of my actions. They hadn't yet realized what I had done, how I had taken control of the land they thought they could rule over. But when they did, when they saw that I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine, they would have no choice but to accept it. I had made my stand. I had taken ownership of the land, the gate, and the future. And as I looked out over the fields, I knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning. The HOA had tried to control me, but in the end, I was the one who held the key. The HOA had no idea what was coming for them. At first, they thought they had me cornered. The fence they had erected was meant to break my spirit, to force me into submission. They had built it with the assumption that I would simply accept the boundaries they imposed, that I would surrender to their control without a fight. After all, it wasn't the first time they had used their power to bully residents into compliance. Most people had just given in, until now. They had underestimated me, and when they finally realized their mistake, it was already too late. The moment I unlocked the gate and reclaimed my access to the land they had tried to restrict, I knew it wasn't just about the fence anymore. It was about sending a message, not just to the HOA, but to everyone who had ever been made to feel small by a system that abused its power. I didn't stop with merely unlocking the gate and walking through it. I didn't stop with just taking back what was mine. No, I was going to show them that their attempts at control would only fuel a much bigger fire. I began to make my farm a space for everyone, a place that was open to all, not just a private sanctuary for myself. I started organizing community events on my farm. I invited my neighbors, everyone who had watched the saga unfold from the sidelines, to come and see what I had accomplished, to experience firsthand what it meant to fight for your land, for your rights. It wasn't just about showing them that I had reclaimed my farm. It was about showing them what was possible when people stood together and fought for something they believed in. The events were simple at first: picnics, barbecues, open days, where people could come, talk, and enjoy the fruits of my labor. But as time went on, the events grew in scale. I organized gardening workshops, educational tours, and small community markets. The farm became a gathering place, a hub of activity and connection. The HOA, of course, took notice. They had always prided themselves on their control over the neighborhood, their ability to dictate every detail of the residents' lives. But now, they saw something they hadn't anticipated, a community coming together, not just in support of me, but in support of something larger. The idea that people should have the right to live freely, to manage their own properties, to make decisions without being bullied into compliance. The HOA didn't know how to react at first. They had assumed that I would cower under their authority, that they could continue to use their rules as a weapon. Instead, they found themselves facing a movement they couldn't ignore. It started with small attempts to intervene. They sent letters claiming that I was violating neighborhood regulations by hosting events on my property. They said I needed permits, that I was disturbing the peace, that I was going against the rules. They expected me to comply, to be intimidated by their bureaucracy. But by this point, I had learned to expect that kind of response from them. It was what they did when they were backed into a corner. They tried to silence dissent with their regulations, with their laws and codes, but I wasn't about to be silenced. Instead of cowering, I fought back. I reached out to my neighbors, to everyone who had supported me, and we rallied together. We sent letters of our own, voicing our support for the changes I had made, for the events I had organized, for the community that had started to form around my farm. We made it clear that we would not stand for the HOA's overreach, that we would not let them use their rules to divide us. We were united, and no amount of letters or threats could take that away. The pressure began to mount on the HOA. The more my neighbors supported me, the more they realized that they were not just fighting one person, they were fighting an entire community that had grown tired of their control. The HOA had always relied on fear, on the assumption that they could intimidate people into submission. But now they were forced to confront something they hadn't counted on: unity. People who had once been quiet, who had never questioned the HOA's authority, were now standing with me. They were standing up for what was right. It wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about the community. It was about reclaiming the space that had once been controlled by a group of faceless individuals who had no understanding of the people they were trying to dominate. It was about proving that the HOA's power wasn't absolute, that there was a limit to what they could do. And as the support from the community grew, the HOA realized they had pushed too far. The pressure from the residents was too much for them to ignore. Finally, they were forced to acknowledge the reality of the situation. They couldn't continue to fight this battle without losing face. They couldn't keep up their facade of control when the community had turned against them. They had no choice but to back down. And so, they did. In the end, the HOA had no choice but to accept the changes I had made. They were forced to recognize my rights as a landowner and acknowledge that their rules could no longer dictate how I lived my life. The boundaries they had tried to impose on me were now meaningless. My farm was no longer a confined piece of land. It had become a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of standing up for what's yours. The fence they had built to isolate me had only served to unite me with my community. It had become the catalyst for something greater. What they had thought would break me had instead strengthened the bond between us. Together, we had turned their attempt at control into a victory, not just for me, but for everyone who had been made to feel small by the HOA's oppressive rules. In the weeks that followed, the changes were evident. The HOA no longer wielded the same power they once had. They had been humbled, forced to accept that their reign of fear had come to an end. The community was stronger now, more united than ever before. We had shown them that there was more to life than following arbitrary rules set by people who didn't understand the needs of those they governed. And while the HOA would continue to exist, their authority had been diminished, their grip loosened. But the most important thing I had gained through all of this was not just my land, not just my farm. It was my freedom. The freedom to live. My life without the constant fear of someone else's rules looming over me. The freedom to make decisions based on what was best for me and my family, without interference from people who had no real understanding of what it meant to be a part of a community. I had reclaimed my space, my voice, and my power. As I stood on my farm, looking out over the fields that had once been restricted by the fence, I knew one thing for certain. I had won, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of authority. The HOA had tried to control my life, to control my land, but in the end, they were the ones who had been controlled. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over my crops, I knew that my victory was just the beginning. The movement I had started was far from over. The HOA had tried to keep me out, to isolate me. But now I was the one, holding the keys. And with those keys, I would continue to unlock new doors, not just for me, but for everyone who had ever dreamed of a life where they were free to live on their own terms. Don't let anyone dictate your life or your land. Stand up, fight back, and reclaim what's rightfully yours. If you're tired of being pushed around by oppressive systems, it's time to take a stand and make your voice heard. Join us on the HOA Stories to see how one person can turn the tables and change everything. Subscribe now and be part of the movement.